first question before we start. You read the term Anthropocene in my title. I'm curious, because how familiar are you with that term? It is, please, more than just, who feels really comfortable with the term Anthropocene? Quick show of hands. More or less everybody. That's good, but it's a shy show of hands, yeah? Okay, so I want to introduce it briefly because it's really an important framing for me, but I promise to keep it short, yeah? And this title, A Mindset for the Anthropocene, this is how our project is now called, and it is for me kind of summarizing this attempt to integrate sustainability and inner transformation and find a framework that allows us to speak about it and move it forward without dichotomizing the inner and the outer. I'm curious how you will think about that in 45 minutes. So I mentioned briefly the background. This ISS Potsdam is really a fascinating place for me to work with because it basically comes from a symposium of Nobel laureates in 2007, where all these great academics basically confessed their frustration and said, like, how can it be that we are generating so much knowledge and we are celebrated for it and we are awarded and so forth? We are providing this knowledge, but so little of this knowledge really makes it into society and into the actual decision-making processes. That was the first thing they did. The second thing, which I found even more remarkable, is they said, we as academics, we only produce a very specific kind of knowledge. But there is so much knowledge present in society that we don't integrate into what we can provide. But we as academics, we are being given a special role. If people ask us for expertise, if our expertise only draws on the academic knowledge, we are missing out lots of the knowledge that is relevant. So how could it be possible to integrate the multiple forms of knowledge present in society as a source for decision-making processes? Those were the two key insights. And back then, they suggested there should be an institution that acts as a hub between different societal sectors to connect the knowledge generation and decision-making processes. And back then, a former minister of the environment in Germany, Klaus Töpfer, had just retired from his position as director of the United Nations Environmental Program. And the German government, Angela Merkel, was present at this final presentation of the Nobel Laureate Symposium, and she and the Minister of Research said, sounds like an awesome idea, let's fund it. Yeah? Let's do it as an experiment. Yeah? And they provided quite generous money for 7 years and said, please experiment with it and see how it's possible to generate such a place. And Klaus Töpfer, who had just retired back then, was asked to lead this process. And it was established 2 years later. And since then, I think this is an experimental playground for these kinds of transdisciplinary, practice-oriented work. So the mission is, and that's important, to actively support societal transformation processes, not just to do research on them and then provide some insights about it, but to really mingle and engage with processes around sustainability in society. And at the same time, through its role in the interface between different sectors, it's also a networking platform and bridge between the different sectors. But rather really to facilitate these kinds of, we call it co-creative processes that integrate people that are representing decision-making processes from the very first stage on. Because what often happens is that a scientist locks up in a room and they develop a solution, and after 3 years of research, they provide something brilliant to somebody, and the decision-maker just says, sounds like a nice idea, but it's totally politically unfeasible. Yeah? This will never become reality because it's missing out the actual processes that are taking place. So maybe we should have spoken first before you set up this project, and to stay connected throughout the process to somehow align the generation of insights. That's the underlying idea. And we are currently, this is our day, we are roughly 200 people at the moment, extremely international, but also extremely broad with our portfolio. You mentioned oceans. We are really working from supporting the German energy transformation to supporting international ocean governance with the United Nations to we worked on soil for quite some time, digitalization and sustainability. Arctic is a focus. It's really a huge area, which is on the one hand the challenge, but on the other hand the real gift, because what we always do is in the events that we host, we allow people to look beyond their normal horizon and explore how are these different topics connected. Because usually people are in their peer group and they are only related to other people who are deep experts in the Arctic, but they don't find out how is this connected to a different field that is organized in a separate silo, you could say. And through this diversity at the Institute, we facilitate the learning across these topics. We have a very generous core funding, which is essential because our founding fathers basically wrote us into the Stammbuch, you could say, like they told us, you're meant to do the things for which nobody else would get funding. Because the third-party funding structures in themselves are shaped by the silo thinking of academic structures. So to do this kind of engagement, you need to invest a lot of time into trust building among stakeholders and exploring networks and so forth. You wouldn't get third-party funding for that. So we give you the freedom, make use of it. If there are no projects that fail, you must have done something wrong. Yeah, that's important. That's important to know the idea of this. And I find this very encouraging because you may know this from your own experience. As an academic, usually you don't share the failures, which is stupid. Yeah, 80% of my experiments failed, and I learned so much from it. What a waste that I couldn't publish them. Others would have benefited a lot from it to know what I did, what didn't work. Yeah? But so, and I said to do these really kind of experimental things, you need to have that freedom and not be forced to report to third-party funders every 3 months. And of course, one of the important framings we're working with is the SDGs. I suppose you're all very familiar with them. The German energy transformation was one important starting topic that we're still working on. And climate and atmosphere is the third one. Not to be confused, please, with the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research, headed by John Schellenhuber. We are closely affiliated, and John Schellenhuber was also closely involved in setting up this institute. We are rather working on air quality, particularly short-lived climate-forcing pollutants, and geoengineering. That's the more controversial and problematic topic. I'm happy to talk about that in a coffee break, if you like. So, my outline with you. I want to speak with you about roughly my perspective of what's the state of the world. That's probably the part you will be most familiar with. Then I will get into the more philosophical aspect. How is our understanding of the nature of reality in the Earth system currently changing? This leads me into the more natural scientifically influenced part about what is transformation in complex systems, actually. And from there to why does inner transformation enter the game as we think about systems change. And as an outlet to it towards the end, and Zach will be sharing more about that also later, I want to introduce this project that we established 2 years ago at the Institute that tries to work in this interface between transformation and sustainability. So I always like to start with this image. There are much nicer images of the Earth, but this is the picture that was above my bed when I wanted to be an astronaut. And so, and I want to invite you for the beginning of this talk to take this very global perspective and look at the Earth as a whole. And of course, you know that in this picture, unfortunately, we don't see anything of human beings, right? But the Anthropocene term is, of course, about the relationship between humanity and the Earth. And the picture that probably all of you know that speaks most intuitively about how that relationship has changed to me still is this one. I don't know how many years it's old. It's almost 20, 18 years old. But it illustrates what a global role already humanity has gained over the last couple of decades and centuries. So you're all familiar with this curve, right? Yeah, shy, nodding. Okay. So I don't need to speak much about it, but I still find it very telling that this term, Anthropocene, was coined around at the year 2000. And where basically the underlying insight is the current changes observed in the Earth system are triggered by humanity, but they're also larger than the natural variations that are observed in the Earth system anyway. That is, and this idea that the human role in the Earth system has changed so much is only 10 years after the people first spoke of globalization. it's interesting if you look at, like, when was the term globalization first used in newspapers? It was around 1990. And 10 years later, Earth system scientists already come to the conclusion, sorry, we are not even just globalizing, but we are already, as a human, uncoordinated collective, the dominant force in the whole Earth system. That's a profound insight, and that to me illustrates how drastic the changes are in short times. So, you know that basically these curves, are being observed for all sorts of indicators that illustrate the dynamics of the Earth system. Has anyone ever looked at the individual ones, like concentration of CO2 over the last couple thousand years? Yeah? A few shy nodding. I find it...
They're all the same.
Okay, they're all the same.
No, I mean, they have this great acceleration.
Okay, you're familiar with this. What I always like to use as an illustration is, to me, the Anthropocene really means that in the Earth system as a whole, when anthropos emerged, we have actually created a subsphere, like the Anthroposphere. And from just being kind of the noise on top of the Earth system, we've moved into this situation where the Anthroposphere is actually covering the dominant part of the whole system. Okay, I'll go through this quickly. I still find it insightful to look at something like CO2 curve over the last 400,000 years and see this great acceleration of the Anthropocene in that kind of perspective. Because that is the change, and it's already 10 years outdated, now we're here. Okay? So that is the hockey stick part of the Anthropocene compared to 400,000 years where you had already a natural variability. Okay? I find it sort of shocking how many people speak about CO2 increase and temperature increase, but have never seen this graph and have never seen it in the perspective of what the Earth system has been like for hundreds of thousands of years. And that this is the contribution of 150 years burning fossil fuels. It just puts it into a different perspective. Okay. The same, of course, is true for the global average temperature. Who has not seen this graph? Please, quick show of hands. Okay, well, I see you skeptic face. You're not so familiar with this. This is more or less the equivalent to the CO2 curve of the last 400,000 years, but for the global average temperature, what we usually summarize as climate. And the interesting part is you see also here that the Earth system has been oscillating between a few degrees warmer and 8 degrees colder. You know, we've also seen Ice Age. We know the Earth looked quite different a while ago. But the interesting part to me is the noise here at the end. It's the last 10,000 years, what Earth system scientists call the Holocene. Because for the Earth system history, that is a very, very special era. Because you see, after all these drastic oscillations of the Earth systemic state, the Earth system has moved into a situation where the global average temperature has been stable for 10,000 years in a framework of plus minus 1 degree. Yeah? And that after these turbulent times before. Has anyone an idea since when we speak of Homo sapiens or when humans emerged? How long is that ago, roughly? Yeah, 200,000. Yeah, quite a while ago. But the interesting thing is, only since here do we observe what we would call civilization development. Yeah, after the Neolithic revolution that humans became settlers and cultivated land and animals, it took several thousand years before we spoke of a couple of cities, and our cultures are here at the end. So these 10,000 years are where we would see the emergence of humans as a global system. Our DNA has not changed between here and here. So what do you think might this situation of the Earth system have to do with the emergence of this global system of humans? Why could this be related? Why didn't we observe this emergence of a civilization here or here? Any idea? What might the emergence of the Holocene, the Earth systemic state, have to do with the emergence of the human civilization? Learning, our whole way of learning, assumes that we have conditions that are stable enough that we can vary something so that we have controllable conditions that we can adapt to. That we take this so much for granted, I believe, right? I mean, this is what we've always done, and that's what we've done for the last 10,000 years. But for human history, it is totally based on this, you can say it's a gift of the Earth system that has provided this stability. For something like agriculture, you need to be at one place over years to try out what works and what does not. What is the right time to really plant the seeds? Yeah? Is it spring or is it autumn? Yeah? This learning while the conditions around you are stable, that really takes a long time. And that only takes place when you have the chance to stay at one place. Nobody would build a city like Hamburg, yeah, or like stay at Hamburg because you find fish there at this time, because you have to move in the next generation already because the sea level is changing too rapidly. These kinds of things. So as long as the whole Earth system, I just want to sensitize you. As long as the Earth system is moving around and changing the conditions all the time, anything like cultural learning is more or less impossible. We didn't even develop social intelligence very much, yeah, because we just didn't stay at one place in bigger tribes. Yeah, this is an important insight to acknowledge that the stability of the Earth system is a precondition for the emergence of the global system that we are a part of at the moment. And basically, from this insight, Earth system scientists, after they spoke about the Anthropocene in the first place, they wondered if those great acceleration curves lead us out of this stability. Yeah, that is the point. These hockey stick developments, they lead us out of this stability, not only for the CO2 level, but for all the indicators that have marked the stability of the last 10,000 years. Moving out of them, yeah, is jeopardizing this stability that has provided the conditions for our global system so far. So after this insight, Earth system scientists wondered, okay, what are the conditions more or less we have to preserve so that this stability stays intact? Are you familiar with the planetary boundaries? Okay, good. I don't have to bother you with that. You know Mr. Rockström very well. Now he's a neighbor. He's the new director at the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research. Good. And you also know this, the donut by Kate Raworth, right? So I find this quite hopeful that from this very global perspective, looking at this, what defines the state of the Earth system as a whole, concretizing what defines the stability of the Earth system, then saying, okay, but what is the social foundation for human life? We don't just want to be in this space at all means, and like say just 0.1% of humans consume material goods, then we might stay in the green space and the planetary boundaries, but that's not our understanding of humane life. So how it's been complemented by Kate Raworth and others in the sustainability donut, defining a safe and just operating space for humanity, and ultimately leading, it's in a very short time. It's within 10 years, all these kinds of developments, before the SDGs were agreed upon in 2015. And of course, you're also familiar that the SDGs, there's sort of an implicit hierarchy, I would say. Yeah? They are not just all, it's very encouraging that it's finally one framework. It's not just the Millennium Development Goals here on the social indicators, but that it integrates social and environmental and economic indicators into one framework. But of course, on the one hand, there is an implicit hierarchy, like preserving the stability of the biosphere, society operating within the conditions of the biosphere, and economy as one part within the framework of society. And of course, you're familiar with, they are all interlinked. Yeah? It's a nasty mess. Yeah? You can't just put them equivalent to each other. There are more of these illustrations also by Johan Rockström and the Stockholm Resilience Center, illustrating how different SDGs are connected. And for our institute, that is an important map, you could say, because quite a few initiatives focus on the SDGs now. And for example, there are some business networks who say, oh, cool, we work on SDG, yeah, we pick the 3, and that is how we maximize our performance towards sustainability. But the connections between the different SDGs are much more difficult to explore and to make visible and to consider. And of course, there's a lot of controversy around the SDGs in themselves. Yeah, I don't want to get into that at this point, because the whole narrative of development, to my understanding, can be put very much into question. But at the same time, I find it a very encouraging step forward that finally there is one internationally agreed framework that integrates social, ecological, and economic indicators into one vision. But like always, of course, this is just like an agenda. It is not the way how to get anywhere. Right? This shouldn't be confused. I spoke with somebody at the UN once who told me this is really supposed to be understood as a new mission statement of the United Nations. So the United Nations were established to foster peace in the world. And now, with this changing situation of humanity, the SDGs are the acknowledgement that peace is no longer what is at stake. It is holistic stability of the whole system. And this is what I find really important step forward, to acknowledge that systemic stability encompasses more than just peace among nations. Okay. And the other thing, of course, that needs to be considered, all of these goals, integrate multiple facets, like, of course, socio-technical developments. The engineers among you, are very familiar with the important developments in that field. But of course, these kinds of innovations need support from political regulations, otherwise they may not see the light of day. And of course, it's also echoed in the way how we organize businesses, for example, or generally how we think of organization structures. The whole way of, for example, centralized energy is connected to also centralized organization structures that are currently put into question. And of course, it also has a cultural and individual dimension, and all of them are again interwoven. So you're really in a mess between all the targets are connected, all the different layers are interwoven, and the politicians say we can't incentivize anything if the people don't vote for that. And the company say we can't do this kind of innovation as long as it's not incentivized by policy. And so this is like moving around the responsibility very often because these are connected. Okay. That was the quick round on what you're probably most familiar with. The part that I find interesting is, to me, it doesn't make sense to speak of any way forward, how to get anywhere regarding these different goals. It's not yet a vision, I would even say. I sometimes feel like I'm interested, what is the underlying vision of a sustainable society that I think has very different facets for the people who have co-developed the SDGs. But the SDGs in themselves, to me, are not representing a vision. How do we as a human community want to live in the future? It's an Agenda 2030, that's very soon. It's a very pragmatic agenda. It's not a deeper vision. To me, it doesn't make sense to think of a way forward as long as we do not understand what is the nature of the situation we are actually facing. It's, to me, informing any step that we might strategically want to take. So I want to take a look with you at what is actually the nature of reality in the Earth system, because that's what we are looking at. And the most important question to me is, can we actually still distinguish between humans, nature, and culture? The term environment often seems to imply like, okay, there's the environment and here is something human. I've only picked out a few examples that may illustrate to us why this distinction might no longer be adequate. Simplest of which would be that there's only very little wilderness, like what we would call pristine nature, left. There's only roughly 20% left in the Earth system that we could call wild nature. Our whole life depends on the availability of oxygen. We can't even say that like nature is providing oxygen for us. Only 11% of the photosynthetic primary production is produced in wilderness. So almost 90% are produced by cultivated land. Not mentioning things like, okay, what are we adding to nature in a way, or to the environment? Thinking of things like that, the plastic production of humans every year is equal to our biomass, and so that's just kind of the comparison we have, how much we are already influencing what is nature, what is not nature. I have, and maybe you're familiar to the work of Bruno Latour, who even speaks of nature culture, like how these terms actually become one. And I always like to share a few images that illustrate this to me. And you can ask yourself, is that nature or is that culture that you see? This is Netherlands, by the way. This is an aqua farm in the Atlantic. This is olives in Spain. You can't see the lines so nice, but that's rice fields in China. It now comes to my favorite. Yeah, it's my favorite. It always reminds me of the Borg. When I lie on the beach right here, where am I? In nature or in culture? I think a friend of mine recently told me there was actually an incident when people were blown away from the beach because an airplane started here and there were side winds and it got a bit off track. So from the engine, people were actually blown away. So
Where is that?
It's in the Pacific, a small island in the Pacific. I don't know the name. All these pictures are taken from Daily Overview, a project by Benjamin Grant. It really changes the way how I personally look at the Earth, I must say. And maybe you've seen movies by Yann Arthus-Bertrand, Terra or Earth, Home. Arthus-Bertrand, he's the one who got famous through this exhibition, World from Above. And this has really shaped his work afterwards. And it has influenced his movies afterwards. To me, that's really changing the way how I look at the Earth that I used to have above my bed a while ago. So, what I find interesting about the Anthropocene discourse that started with understanding the relationship between humans and Earth system is that it's actually questioning. It's actually questioning this understanding. Still in the year 1800, there was clearly this dichotomy between here is culture and there is nature, and it's only 200 years, which is really nothing in human history, that we are actually acknowledging in the Anthropocene discourse, we are dissolving this seeming distinction between humans and the Earth. It is really moving or morphing into understanding it is one connected system. What is new to me is that basically the cultural thread that has developed the separation becomes aware of the limitations of that, of the shortcomings of that understanding. That because the Anthropocene term in itself can, I would say, justify to be criticized for playing with this dichotomy. It's sort of an astronaut's view, and the astronaut is detached. A colleague of mine published an article a year before the term Anthropocene was coined, and he said it was called Astronaut's View, the temptation of world steering in ecology. Because environmental science, which he's now 75, he had witnessed the emergence of environmental science for some time. He said, in this astronaut's view, we look at it and believe, okay, we can tinker around with the Earth. And this perspective has also brought up the emergence of the term Anthropocene. And at the same time, through this term Anthropocene, the connectedness between humans and the environment has actually gained momentum in the last 50 years. That's what I find interesting. Some see it as a further split towards anthropocentrism, saying like Anthropocene shall be, because the Earth is just there for humans. At the same time, I feel this term is stimulating the reflection on what is the actual role of humanity in the Earth, and it reintegrates humans in the system. So that's what I see as a hopeful thread. But of course, it's not new at all. So maybe it's the original sense that we've just been alienated from. I don't know. Yeah. But I will speak later about how this sort of, let's say, new remembering, shapes the way how we need to think about transformation. Do we do it from a steering understanding, or do we do it from a systems understanding? That's what I want to get at. So, and in a way that is to me illustrating a change in a worldview, from this more anthropocentric or egocentric. Unfortunately, it's not coincidence that a male figure is put here on top and the woman is clearly below. I think this unfortunately adequately illustrates a worldview that has been dominant for a long time in Western societies. But moving from the egocentric to an ecocentric worldview, to me, is clearly fostered through the whole Anthropocene discourse. You said Enlightenment, I would go back further to Greek philosophy.
But Enlightenment is inspired by that.
That's the trouble.
Yeah.
So, and I mean, of course, they build on something as well, right? It's not out of the blue. But okay, you follow with me to the Greek history, yeah? And we sort of agree the Western scientific paradigm is really based on this subject-object division, just for analytic purposes. And it's interesting that I had a philosophy colleague in my soccer team during the studies, yeah, and I asked him, like, actually, you in philosophy, are you discussing quantum science? Yeah? And he said, no. I said, yeah, but it's changing the whole way how we see the nature of reality, doesn't it? He said, I don't know quantum science. I know that you are very interested in, and Whitehead was as a process philosopher, was also a natural scientist by training. We have a wonderful philosopher at the Institute. He's an expert in time and space from a philosophical angle, but she said, most of my reading has had to be in physics because the whole understanding of time and space in physics has changed in the last 100 years. The question that I have is, to what extent are the insights of these sciences integrated into the way how we relate to the world? And I felt quite a split there, that we are still interacting with the world as if it was the machine we used to think it was in the year 1800. And we're not fully integrating these insights from various fields, not only quantum physics. There are other scientific fields that foster this reintegration and challenge the distinction between subject and object. And yeah, like you said, exactly, the Enlightenment, yeah. One of the quotes of Whitehead that has become quite famous is, the safest general characterization of philosophical tradition of Europe is that it consists of a series of footnotes on Plato. Yeah. So yes, you can really trace it back to the roots that were planted here. But of course, also in European philosophy and history, there have always been different threads. The question is, to me, what was dominant? What has shaped the dominant course of our society so far? And that, to me, is really deeply influenced by this split, by this distinction. So this brings us into complex systems theory, actually. If we challenge this distinction, if we admit that the human being cannot be seen isolated from the environment, but that it's really one integrated system, then we need to look at how do these systems function. Because as long as we don't understand what the systemic logic is, then we have no way to really do something, right? And how it is informing our strategies. The annoying thing about complex systems is that now I would like to really speak about the whole system, like the coupled human-Earth system. Probably the system is even bigger, but let's speak of the coupled human-Earth system for a moment. The trouble is the way how that system looks as a whole emerges as a result of self-organization processes. It is complex actually means nonlinear and stochastic relationships. So you have phenomena that are not just simple linear causal effect chains, but it's really those weird interactions that you do something here and it triggers 5 effects here, and you do the same thing and it triggers different distributions because it's only probabilities of effects, and it's no longer, you cannot predict, and that's the thing. We spoke about the advantage of stable conditions because it allows us to predict, to plan, to calculate, and to adapt. In complex systems, unfortunately, that whole idea of predicting is challenged, which is nasty because we want to do something about the future. Yeah, I think we have cultivated this understanding of prediction so much, it is very difficult to get rid of it and to admit in a complex system I cannot predict. I heard a talk at the conference where actually the two of us met by one of the, to me, most, I don't know so many that I could say one of the most inspiring, but one of the ones I know, really one of the most inspiring complex systems theorists, Stuart Kauffman. Also, he's almost 80 by now. He's an old man, has a long history behind him. And he spoke about radical emergence in complex systems, and he was part of a group. They tried to manipulate complex systems. Yeah? So like, how can we steer a system from here to there? And he summarized his talk at the end with the statement like, sorry guys, hands off complex systems. Whatever you do, you blow up the system. Yeah, you try to intervene here to steer it there. It just doesn't work. You can't find the right lever. You remember the professor I admired 10, 15 years ago, yeah? He said there is no right lever that can steer the system here or there. And that's the more profound insight behind it. This state of the system as a whole, yeah, as much as it goes through different like aggregational states within the system. Yeah, of course, there are so-called hierarchies also in complex systems. But it's not about here a decision is made that shifts the system in a certain state. But the system as a whole represents something like, you could call it an energetic optimum for the system, which is based on the nature of relationships among the smallest elements. And that, to me, as a semiconductor physicist, yeah, I would say the question whether a crystal, like a diamond, for example, whether it takes a hexagonal or quadratic, yeah, rectangular, yeah, a rectangular or quadratic structure or a hexagonal structure. You cannot make the crystal become this or that while it grows. But it's determined by the energetic optimum for a given nature of relationships. If I'm an atom and I like to bond with 4 other colleagues, yeah, and 4 is the maximum number or the best number for me to be an energetic optimum, that determines how the crystal from the outside will look. If it's 5 or 6, yeah, that makes a change on the outside. In the middle between it, I cannot trick the crystal to be different. And that is to me a fundamental shift to acknowledge the system as a whole is based on the nature of relationships within the system. And only through you could say, of course, you can mix elements in a system, yeah, and with different bonding natures. But if there is a dominant bonding nature, that will shift the system into one direction. Yeah, Pascal.
I know you haven't made your argument completed yet, but it's just what it made me think of what you say right now. It almost has this kind of deterministic tone to it. Like in complex systems, you will never be able to trigger change the system because the fundamental relationship between the smallest parts of the system are as they are. And I don't think that's the argument you want to make, but it just that was what it made me think of right now, and that was kind of scary.
Yes, I didn't not want, and I hope I did not say the relationships are as they are. Because of course, in the human Earth system is not just a complex system, it's a so-called cognitive complex system. Of course, the way how we relate, and that's the next step in the argument, is something we can actively shape. Yeah? The human relationships, the relationships you have to your environment, are not fixed. Yeah? They are subject to change. And the question is, what changes these relationships? But it makes a major difference to see, and of course also here are relationships in the higher aggregation state. Yeah? Clouds with each other have relationships, not only the droplets or not only the water molecules. The question is, where do you look for change? Do you look for change by installing kind of a lever that shifts the system, or do you see relationship nature as the field where change is actually happening? That is why I'm focusing so much here on this aspect. If we are willing to acknowledge that systems change comes through the emergence into an energetically optimum state that is constituted through the nature of relationships, then nature of relationships becomes the field where we try to change, which is a different thing than intervening at a certain aggregation stage in order to trick the system into being different. Do you see what I'm getting to? Yeah, Annika?
I don't know if you've heard of this project in Lund where they do a research project on leverage points.
Yes.
And that's precisely what you're criticizing now, so you're saying that what they're doing is impossible.
Huh. Yes and no. No, we will be at the Leuphana next February for that conference, and I find the idea of the leverage point extremely important. Basically, what it tells me, I mean, first thing, of course, system science has advanced a lot since Donella Meadows established her idea of the leverage point. But of course, there are different hierarchical layers in systems. So if you speak of relationships, it's not only the relationships here, but of course also a ministry, for example, is a certain aggregation in the system, has relationships. And an institution that you create, or a rule in the system, is a relationship. And in that sense, it would be one of these leverage points, you could say. But it makes to me a huge difference whether I frame it as a lever or as something as a relationship that I craft.
Really quick, because I'll speak to this too. The project that we work on is actually organized in some sense around leverage points. So just to make a sort of finer point on it, it's actually not that we don't find that helpful or useful. Actually, it's quite the contrary. And I think just to add a point, there's like 12 leverage points, I think, something like that, and they're organized at different scales, sort of, which maps on, I think, quite nicely to the discussion that you just had about complex systems, because what you're talking about as the sort of lever, as a shorthand, is more trying to, in a more conventional sense within sustainability, change higher order systems without looking at what you're saying is patterns of relationship, which Donella Meadows in the leveraged system locates at mindsets and paradigm, sort of what she perceives to be the maximum potential for change happening at that the first or second order of systems, as opposed to the 10th, 3rd, 11th, or 12th order of systems, which happens at structures, sort of an institution, which is higher order complexity. So actually, if you look at the whole system that she's developed, she's sort of similarly mapped out hierarchies of structure in terms of lower order and higher order complexity. And all that you're saying is that to really create systemic change, rather than tweaking a higher order system like an institutional structure that is really overly complex, so that if you intervene at any one area, you don't know what the impact will be because there's so many coordinated effects that are unpredictable. What we're saying is that we look at lower order systems like mindsets or paradigms, which are systemically pervasive, but which shape all the higher orders, if that makes sense. It's just a different. So actually, it's quite useful for us too. It's just we're focused more on that than that.
An example I wanted to give is why it makes such a difference to me to speak of a lever or a relationship is when, for example, a decision maker wants advice on something and you provide him information on do this and that. It is, to me, it's usually not a relationship change. The underlying assumption that I hear is you change something in the system and that does the job. This can, in a way, like disconnected. Like in a machine, like you pull the lever or it's different to me than identifying an aggregation level where the leverage point is something that affects these and those kinds of relationships and cultivates a quality of relationship or a pattern of relationship that is resonant with the desired state of the system. That's to me the underlying idea. Through all these leverage points, it's about changing relationships. The patterns across all these different layers of relationships needs to be resonant with the state of the system that is sort of desired or envisioned. And that connection is usually not made. To see it as a relationship that in itself portrays the nature of relationships that runs through the whole system. That's to me the distinction. And I guess you can see how that is challenging the whole idea of control or predictability. We spoke about that briefly, which I found extremely prominent in the sustainability community that I was exposed to. I felt like it's searching for the best way to control. And to me, the whole idea of control implies a non-understanding of the systemic nature, which I find problematic. You get this idea? This is, and it's difficult to be in an academic system that has cultivated this idea for such a long time. It bases on the idea like how to prove best control and best predictability. And that's the tension I feel because it has such a long history. So the important aspect to me is, if we care about the system as a whole, our attention must shift to the kind of relationships and the qualities that run through these relationships across all different hierarchical layers. I'll be sharing the slides with you, by the way, just in case. And this is a discussion that has gained a lot of momentum in Germany, but also in other countries in the last couple of years. This focus on what is actually the nature of relationships in society. And are you familiar with the work of Hartmut Rosa? You Germans might be. I mean, he's a sociologist. He basically has written a critique of social sciences. It's an 800-page book. It's very impressive. I didn't read the entire thing. You can also read a shortcut sometimes. But I had the chance to hear an interview with him where he also explains it very briefly, and I spoke with a colleague of his who explained the concept more deeply. But he promised me the 800 pages are readable, even for a sociologist. I didn't dare to read the entire thing yet. But what he primarily does is he critiques his own academic field for focusing on only the utilitarian relationships of humans. So sociology has been influenced so much by mathematics and statistics that they try to quantify all relations and reduce, like through concepts like Homo economicus, the human being, to only his utilitarian relationships. A similar discussion is actually going on in neurobiology. Maybe you're familiar with the work of Gerald Hüther, who is interested in the field of learning and shows how learning takes place in the brain depending on whether we do something from a functional logic or from a being-based logic. Just if you learn something for the fun of it, because you like it, not because it serves a purpose for you, like a function, utilitarian purpose for you. Very insightful, and there are other discussions like, I feel very much reminded actually of the kind of discussions I read in Erich Fromm, To Have or To Be, in the 70s and 80s. The thread that goes through these discussions at the moment is to first acknowledge the historically grown dominance of functional and utilitarian relationships, and at the same time put into question whether this is actually what is beneficial for the human being and for the environment. With whom did I speak about ecosystem services? Oh, with you, Sana, yeah. But we spoke briefly about ecosystem services, and the experience I made is that environment is treated in an anthropocentric way because of its utility for the human being, not as something of intrinsic value. And as long as we don't acknowledge that as the nature of relationships between humans and non-human life, yeah, it's difficult to make wise action. For many people, that's just a given. Yeah? Well, that's the nature of relationships we have, and we're not even aware of it. This discussion, to me, is really fostering that self-reflection. Utilitarian relationships. And I will get later to how I find that insightful to myself. Am I part of utilitarian relationships, or am I part of, Hartmut Rosa calls it resonant relationships, like where I am a being and I relate with other beings, or am I a function and I relate with other functionalities? That's something, yeah, we certainly each have to reflect for ourselves, but I witnessed this bias very much. And in that context, I read a book that was recommended to me by, what's his name, the co-author? Not Rockström, the other one. Jørgen Randers. Are you familiar with him? He's Norwegian. He was a co-author of the study Limits to Growth by the Club of Rome in the 70s. And I had the pleasure to sit next to him at a dinner, and he recommended this book, Ishmael by Daniel Quinn. He's an environmental biologist and a Christian monk. And what he does in this book, it's a Socratic dialogue between a pupil and a teacher. And he responds to an announcement in the newspaper like, teacher seeks pupil must have earnest desire to save the world. And the pupil thinks, oh my God, this must be cheating. This must be a stupid guy. I don't know. But I'll try it out. I'm curious. What is it? And he finds a gorilla sitting in an apartment in Manhattan. And he engages in a Socratic dialogue with the gorilla, and the gorilla takes him back through what is your narrative of what it means to be human, and what your relationship to the earth is. And he goes back step by step and deconstructs what is my location as a self in the world. And he goes back to the Neolithic Revolution, to the emergence of the Holocene. I don't want to tell you the whole book. It's very short. It's really insightful. The idea he basically gets to, and that's swinging back to enlightenment. He says, basically what you humans did was you were afraid about your existence. And you cultivated the land in order not to be afraid that there wouldn't be enough tomorrow. I, as a gorilla, I eat what I'm being given, in a way, I move, I'm a nomad, it's okay, but basically, he says, most beings always cultivate the trust in what is there. You human beings decided, say, I functionalize the environment to create safety for my existence. That is the underlying idea he identified in the Neolithic Revolution. Becoming settlers in the first place, cultivating the land, doing agriculture in the first place. Utilizing the environment as a strategy to pacify human existential fear. That is I would just want to toss it out as a very provocative thought, and to ask ourselves, to what extent is that something that shapes our own relationality? How are we subject to existential fear, and what are we utilizing to pacify this fear? So he ends up with this idea like, actually this fear is the driving force between the plundering of the earth. And he summarizes that in that statement that in that quote I've given you about that. You're captives of a civilizational system that more or less compels you to go on destroying the world in order to live. I find this extremely telling. And actually Al Gore said something similar in his book, Wege zum Gleichgewicht, what was it called in English? Earth in the Balance. He said it like, we have become addicts to consuming the earth from which we have alienated ourselves. And this whole pattern of being addicted to consuming in order to sustain the own existence. So there are three key insights that I take away from the systems perspective. The first thing is really we cannot dichotomize between agent and system. Yeah? Whatever we are agent in our systemic context. Yeah? And that to me challenges the whole idea of providing solutions for others, which is very popular in our society and in sustainability. Provide solutions for others. That they do this and that. You know better what they should do. It's a very problematic concept. There is no systems control in the conventional sense. Yeah? The whole idea of predicting what's happening is deeply challenged. And rather, the systems transformation is about changing relationship patterns. That is what I really want to emphasize. And that, as I said, runs across the different leverage points. But it's about identifying and changing patterns of relationality. Okay, I need to speed up a little bit. But this is why, to me, inner transformation becomes so important. Changing relationship patterns. I don't want to bother you very much with the overwhelm of complexity that we all experience, right? The example I always like to use is our cell phone. We all have one, and we cannot assume that all these topics, these global topics, are far away. With only one material in such a mobile phone, we are in the middle of all these seemingly global issues. Coltan is again in mines in Central Africa under very inhumane working conditions. Land is destroyed, like biodiversity is destroyed for it. You know all this, yeah? There are no proper regulations for the water and stuff. So, and this is only one material and one of our everyday life items. Yeah, I think it's important to acknowledge we are all very much overwhelmed with this complexity. And also the people we are working with at our institute are overwhelmed with this complexity. And they all believe, okay, we have to do it all simultaneously. At the same time, they hope somebody else takes care of it because they are already doing their best. And I really like to recommend a book to you by a psychologist who wrote about complexity in the 80s. It's called On the Logic of Failure. And he identifies how the human mind is shaped by this idea of controllability, even though complex systems behave otherwise. For example, in behavior, like when a certain problem is identified in a system, he did these experiments with people they had to kind of manage a little village, for example. Yeah? And maybe there was a water shortage. One problem occurs. What the human mind usually does is, oh, there is a problem. Do something about it. another problem comes up. As a response to that, oh, another one. And that people follow responding to the problems that occur. And he went through examples in history where people did this and how this is also embedded in our structural logics and governance systems, and how then we blow up the system. While he identified people who acted differently, who said, there is a problem, okay. What is this phenomenon connected with? And before they acted, they spent quite some time, what are the relationships? Okay, maybe I do a little bit here, a little bit here, a little bit here, now I wait. Yeah? Okay, something's changing here. And people who first try to understand the system instead of following that impulse of responding. And that was, he goes through that in detail. I really like to recommend it to see for ourselves how do we decide when we are exposed to complex decisions. The challenge is really, now that the problems are so big and complex, how do we integrate the different perspectives that are relevant to address them? Yeah, there is no one expertise that can solve it alone, and that's something we identified in the beginning already. The observation I made is that really there is a widespread hope that just somebody else takes care of it. Yeah, this moving around of responsibility, particularly manifested in hopes about technology and governance. The need for collaboration, yes, it is widely acknowledged, but practically, my experience is it's not really meeting the reality. People are not really able to collaborate. They are not even able to listen to each other. And we have, okay, long stories behind it. I want to cut that short. But usually power dynamics and short-term interests overwhelm this perceived need for collaboration. And of course, and you're aware of that, even if the understanding of all the situation is there, action doesn't have to be in line with that. That's a huge gap between understanding and action. Still, we want to do something, right? That's where we agree. We don't just, like you said, the relationships are not fixed. So the challenge, from my perspective, is how do we cultivate relationship patterns that are coherent with the desired systemic state? Yeah, linking back to what I said earlier. And that is what brings me to basically changing the perspective into what does it mean to be in that systemic context. And here I really don't want to just see this as an individual, yeah, but thinking of the different leverage points, this can be any kind of aggregation state. And of course, the most difficult part for me at first is actually to identify and locate oneself in the systemic context. What are the actual relations? Where are we actually effective? Or are we focusing on solutions somewhere else that are actually not the relationships in which we are effective? And I really see this in relationships are not just my relationship to you in this moment or my friends. We relate to the systemic context in very different ways. Yeah? To, of course, things that we use or consume, but also through institutions and rules that we either create or that we follow. It shapes also our relationality, or through information that we consume or that we share. The second question would be, to me, to what extent are these relations actually expressing my intentionality? For a business, for example, maybe you've heard of the concept of common good economics, Gemeinwohlökonomie. It takes such an effort for a company to become aware of the own relationality within the systemic context. It's a long self-reflexive process. How am I relating as an organization? And then to reflect, is that actually our intention as an organization? What is the intention of an organization? Where is that actually made conscious? And the third part, if we acknowledge the importance of intention as a source to shape relationality, is which inner state of mind allows me actually to be transformative in these relations? Like, am I an object to these relations, that the relations actually shape my own being? Or am I in an inner state that allows me to be transformative through these relationships in which I'm embedded? You know these examples, right? Basically, that's the knowledge-action gap. Even if we are aware of our relationship patterns, it doesn't mean that we can actually change them. And Dennis Meadows, who I also really like, he was the lead author of this study, Limits to Growth, at the Club of Rome. He gave a talk 2 years ago, and you're laughing about this. He basically gave a talk to the Club of Rome under the heading, "Why didn't we learn?" And he basically told them, for 40 years, this round was convinced that providing the right information will change the system. Just providing it to people who are in charge, right? And yeah, we were very honored and happy that they say, "Oh, thank you for telling us, now we can really do something." He said, no, nothing happened. Yeah? And he said, knowledge is the one thing, but as long as we don't care, as long as it doesn't reach our hearts and we see our deeper relationality with it, it will not have any effect on how we behave. So he ended with the question, how do we learn to care? And what is a group like this actually contributing to the emergence or to the cultivation of care as something that shapes relationality? Additional to knowledge, not as an either or, but as an important dimension to it. And also that is of course not new. Yeah, here's the Donella Meadows you mentioned. It's not the leverage point, but it's very similar. She speaks of the increasing leverage within systems. Patterns of behavior as a first, systemic structures that of course incentivize and manifest them, and mental models underneath. And this is sort of what my interest has more and more shifted into, because so many speak about societal transformation as if it's just about changing practices, different behavior, different governance system, or different kinds of action. But to me, it's really important to look first at the underlying behavior patterns, systemic structures, and particularly the mental models that shape the way how we interact with the world, and the way how we create our interaction. And we do that particularly around ethics, worldviews, and ontologies, but we explicitly do this at least a bit vague to shed light on this whole field of what we would call inner transformation. There are different terminologies for it all over the place. But to shift the attention a bit away from this focus only on the manifestation to the underlying inner aspects of transformation of the system. What does this encompass? This is, of course, that is what is covered with terms like mindsets, worldviews, ethics, and so forth, mental qualities. What is so problematic about this, in a way, is this is not a cognitive process. Right? Yeah, it's a pity, but I don't become more empathic just by understanding, oh, it's important to be more empathic to change the system. Right? It's how do I do that? It's not, and it's not just a cognitive process, but we are heavily focusing on cognitive education at the same time. So it's not meeting also the channels how we learn. And the other thing, which is also a challenge in our system, is I would say it cannot really be taught. I cannot make somebody else be different. And you cannot make me more mindful or compassionate, right? Damn it, yeah? Maybe there's a pill one day or some hormone, yeah, that makes you more empathic. I don't know. It cannot be taught. And in the role that we are usually asked to serve, it's often about, please tell us the solution. I can't, yeah? I don't know you enough to really know what is best for you, but in this context, it really cannot be taught. It's an experiential process. And that's one of the hopes on the other side. There's, of course, many approaches how these qualities and how a different ontology or a different way of being can be cultivated. And it's not only by, but particularly being boosted by neuroscience in the last 15, 20 years. So this at least helps to overcome this dichotomy between natural science-dominated perspective on sustainability, that also a naturally scientific grounded field like neuroscience shows our brain and our mind is plastic. And the qualities how we are not fixed. Yeah? Our relationships and the way how we engage in relationships is not fixed, but is a subject to self-determined change. That's the important thing. It is something we do not autonomously, but self-guided. Yeah? But it cannot be taught to others, like imposed on others, like knowledge is just spilled over people. It's too bad. Which is, again, challenging the idea of control, right? I mean, it's so nice if you can just provide something to others, believing it's the solution for others, because it implies this idea of controlling something. So there are various approaches to it, from experience-based learning. Contemplation is one of them, but also I would see coaching or arts processes as a being-oriented transformation of inner qualities. To come to an end, to introduce what we've been doing about it, is our observation was, unfortunately, this is really two split fields. Sustainability is one community, and it's focusing on governance, technology, consumption, and so forth. Yeah. Consciousness is a different field. It is really remarkably separated. And people who, it's discussed rather in the context of well-being, maybe leadership, yeah, and personal development, but it's private. Yeah? When we spoke with people first, they said, from our peers, and we said, we are interested in this, I cannot make this, I cannot talk about empathy in my context. I'm immediately like the esoteric weirdo. Yeah? Sorry, I can't do that. But I'm extremely interested in what you find out. I'm interested in knowing other people who think differently, who see it as an essential basis for their engagements for sustainability. I feel so lost, it's such a machine that I'm working in, and I want to, hey, what is the actual purpose? How can we cultivate a different way of being? But I cannot speak to people in the way that I find out how they actually are. I feel lost, and I can't expose without jeopardizing my role, my legitimacy. Because there is this split. And that was the point that we talked about. We wondered, shall we write a paper about this? What is needed to foster the synergies between us? But also the other way around, right? There are many people in this consciousness community for whom it's a very isolationist thing. Just like, I want to sit on my cushion and meditate and feel better. Full stop. Yeah? What should that have to do with the environment? There are more and more initiatives and people who say, no, we see this as a contribution to a change of society and as a change to the way how we relate to the environment. But these people don't have access to these circles where societal decisions about structures and so forth are being made. So we thought, we want to overcome this split and see what is the integration of the two. Zach will be sharing more about this in a moment. But this is where we established our project, Mindset for the Anthropocene, as a hub where these two fields can meet and search for integration. Our intention is, guiding question is, what does the cultivation of inequalities have to do with sustainability? And how can an integration, like an integrated third approach that really draws on both fields, emerge? And the intention is to strengthen people and processes that aim for this integration. It's not just to do research on it, but to actively strengthen these connections. Mindfulness and compassion have a certain focus of attention at the moment, but of course the field is much broader. I think you have heard of the Binka project, right, where the connection between mindfulness and material consumption is being explored. Health and well-being is, of course, another field that is, because it's still also much focused on the individual, that's in the intention, but also environmental protection. Like how does the cultivation of mindfulness allow people to perceive nature differently and develop different relationships, not just as cognitive information, but as a different appreciation for the intrinsic value of nature, and hence induce a different behavior. And cultural change, like for example, changing pro-social behavior, or how does cultivation of compassion have an impact on negotiation dynamics and so forth. That's another field of interest. And the connecting thread for me in all of these is the de-automization of habituated unconscious behavior patterns. And that is what I find so interesting about it, like guiding the own awareness to underlying patterns of relationships, and then seeing how can, through this cultivation, these patterns be changed and hence inform the way how I relate with my surroundings. So I think I said most of it already, but to briefly let you know, on the one hand, of course, we are at a research institute, so we also do research in order, particularly to foster also the legitimacy of a discourse that integrates the two fields. But a lot of what we do is connecting and empowering change agents. from these two fields, providing spaces where they can connect, interact, get to know each other, and empower each other. And the third important part to me is working on it is the one thing, but to me the most important part is how do we live that ourselves? How do we practice a different way of being in the systemic context that we are a part of? And how do we share this process of becoming different so that it can inspire others without kind of teaching it? It's quite a challenge. We're still searching for a good way. How do we share these processes? How do we document it? How do we find out what is really changing in our way of being? But it's important for us to experiment with this and see ourselves as a living laboratory, you could say, as the subject of research, and not just as people who do research on something and do something for others, but see ourselves as transforming subjects in this connection. A lot has to do with really mapping these connections. I don't want to get into details on that, but we are hosting a website and database, basically, where we collect institutions that bridge these fields. And so that others can explore who is interested, for example, in the connection between compassion and climate change. And see, does he do that on a structural focus or technological focus or individual focus? Like a navigation tool for these connections between interchange and sustainability. Also geographically, but we are at the beginning of identifying where are people and institutions that you might want to approach when you're interested in this field. Just to give you a glimpse of in which direction this is going, as a sort of compass for people and institutions interested in this connection. I briefly want to say something about the kind of process that we see behind it, because it's not just the challenge and the beauty at the same time is the diversity that we're working with. Both at the Institute, but also with the stakeholders that we are engaging with. And what I care very much about is that relationship work is very context specific. And in the end, each of us, if we want, is about to transform our own relationship context. So this is something that is as diverse as the context from which people are originally from. What we want to do is we want to invite people from very diverse contexts around this shared intention of integrating inner transformation and sustainability, facilitate the actual deeper process of transforming our worldviews, ontologies, and so forth, but at the same time allowing them to translate these more profound findings into specific practice. What does this mean for me as a policy advisor at the think tank, blah, 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 when I'm doing a briefing with a politician? What does this mean for me as an entrepreneur that I'm just establishing a startup? Yeah? How does this reflection and awareness changing process for me manifest in the way how I develop my organization, how I assess my impact in society, what have you? Yeah? I don't know. And the challenge is how to facilitate a learning that connects and at the same time allows for this diversity. And that's what to me is the framework of co-creation, and but at the same time there's no blueprint how to do this. Yeah? It has a lot to do with letting go, but at the same time finding the common denominator to some point to really inspire each other. And we are sort of really just facilitating and hosting that discourse. We are not providing solutions for anyone. And that is difficult to report about. Yeah? People are, okay, what do you get out? So, ask people who have been with us what they got out. And that's where the change actually happens. And how has the engagement with us hopefully supported and inspired them in doing something different? And that was also the conference we did at the Lafana recently, yes. It was about education, and it's about empowering change agents in the educational sector. How does our understanding of being really transform the way how we develop education? Be it in pedagogical concepts, be it in regulation, in the way how we organize schools and so forth. That is the way how I see manifestation or outcome of this process. And it's a challenge, and at the same time, it's what I love most of it. And I must say, to me, it's really changing the way how I look at this picture that I shared with you at the beginning. Because to me, it is a different path than the one I saw above when I wanted to be an astronaut. I still love to come back to that picture. So to wrap it up, okay, the overview of the Anthropocene discourse, you were familiar with that, but most part for me is about thinking, what does systems thinking really mean if we take it seriously? On the one hand, about non-duality of humanity and nature, the limits of control, and the focus on relationship patterns as the field where we need to put our attention to if we are caring about transformation. To me, that is the reason why inner and outer human relationality really need to be thought in one framework. And I briefly gave a glimpse into what are potentials of inner transformation as a contribution or part of sustainable development, but that's also what Zach will be sharing more details about how this disintegration takes place. My personal conclusion, which is not a conceptual one, is to me the continuous question I ask myself is really, can I be what I wish for the world? Or how am I embodying this mismatch in my own being? And that's an ongoing learning, and it's not always an easy learning, because also I'm part of structures that incentivize a certain way of being and so forth. How can I be on the inside what I wish for the world? The other thing is really my own relationality is through a long history of my life so far, of course, shaped by the functionality that I see as a dominant pattern in the system. How and where can I overcome this focus while the structures around me incentivize functional relationships? You know? When fellows come to us, we are just providing an unconditional basic income to them for a temporary certain time span. It is challenging the logics of giving a task and what do you get out, and you have to know in advance what exactly this and that person delivers to you at the end of your stay. No, we want to cultivate a different way of being. But this is a challenge in the system. Yeah? It's a, what are you doing? Are you nuts? Yeah? And we are being evaluated by other systemic contexts, and they look critically at this. And the other thing is for our continuous work, the underlying pattern that I see very much as dominant in our history is this a pattern that Neil Quinn distinguishes between in the Ishmael between the takers and the leavers. Take it or leave it. And this dominance of a relationship pattern that takes space and occupies from a self-centric point of view, as opposed to a leaving position of letting space for emergence. And also that, now I've occupied very much space here in sharing my own learning. I've taken a lot of space to share with you. How do we find a good way of taking space and leaving space for intrinsic emergence? And how do we cultivate spaces and structures that work constructively with both? Because I've also experimented a lot with spaces that only let go and give space for emergence, but without framing and clarity of input, it becomes very diffuse. You might lack the coherent focus. But generally, I see a deep need for shifting more and more towards the leaving space instead of taking space. And also that is something for self-observation in all relationships that we are part of. Boy, you've been listening very long to me. I'm not speaking a lot. I'm certainly past the times already. I find it important to emphasize that really all what we're talking about here in terms of sustainability is a learning journey. It has a lot to do with letting go of the impulse to provide answers, which is totally against what we are being asked to do, but rather to invite into a learning process around the shared intentions and really explore these more profound questions. As a last thing, I would like to share a quote with you that has guided me very much. It's by Picasso. If you still have a moment of headspace left before we are all in need of a break, I would like to share it with you, because Picasso summarized his philosophy as, I don't seek, I find. Seeking, that is starting from old stocks, and the drive to find what is familiar in the new. Finding, that is the entirely new. New also in motion. All ways are open, and what is found is unfamiliar. It is a venture, a sacred adventure. The uncertainty of those ventures can only be taken on by those who feel safe in insecurity, who are led in uncertainty and guidelessness, who let themselves be drawn by the target and don't define the target themselves. Such openness toward any new insight, external and internal, that is the nature of the modern human, who despite all the fear of letting go, nevertheless experiences the blessing of being held in the opening of new possibilities. I'm curious how far we will get. Thank you very much for listening for so long.